From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Vice President Kamala Harris holds her first campaign rally since President Biden's withdrawal from the 2024 election. What was her pitch to voters and her strategy for taking on Donald Trump? Plus, the Democratic Senate prepares to lose a longtime member after New Jersey's Bob Menendez is found guilty on corruption counts. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua. What a tumultuous 72 hours in the life of Kamala Harris. 3 days ago, she was Joe Biden's sidekick. But after he pulled out of the election on Sunday, she has all but inherited the Democratic nomination, Joe Biden's line on the ballot, and even Joe Biden's campaign manager. But now Kamala Harris has an opportunity to put out her own message, to try to define herself and her own presidential priorities. On Tuesday afternoon, Harris was in a suburb of Milwaukee in the swing state of Wisconsin for her first big rally in a high school gymnasium. Some reports say that it drew about 3,000 people, and the campaign was scrambling to find a bigger venue than was originally planned. Here is part of what Harris said going after her opponent, Donald Trump.
Before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
And here she is laying out her vision for the U.S.
We believe in a future where every person has the opportunity not just to get by, but to get ahead. A future where no child has to grow up in poverty. Where every worker has the freedom to join a union. Where every person has affordable health care, affordable child care, and paid family leave. We believe in a future where every senior can retire with dignity.
Kim, what do you make of this as a pitch from the new presumptive Democratic nominee?
Well, it's a reminder, Kyle. I was watching this, just how crazy this race had become prior to Joe Biden's withdrawal. I mean, what you hear there is enthusiasm for a Democratic Party that is thrilled to have a nominee that can put three words together in a row. I mean, and that's where we had been, is that we had this very unequal race where one of the candidates, Joe Biden's infirmities, truly were impeding his ability to prosecute this race and run for re-election. So what the Democrats have done here is they've retained for themselves a candidate who has eliminated the age issue for them and the kind of decrepit old president image that was dragging down the party. She has already managed to avoid a nasty competition for the nomination, it would seem. Everybody came out and immediately endorsed her. There's this enormous sense of relief among Democrats that they can finally focus once again, as you heard there, on Donald Trump. I think the big question going forward is, does Kamala Harris use this moment to pivot a little bit away from Joe Biden's policies that a lot of people are unhappy about in the country and try to endear herself with more swing and independent voters? That speech she gave to me suggests she's not going to, that she is going to double down on what has so far been an almost Democratic obsession with revving up their liberal base. She's got a natural affinity with women voters, younger voters, minority voters. From the looks of it, it sounds like she's going to try to continue pitching left to recoup and drive up the numbers among those voters. But I think there's a huge missed opportunity here.
My takeaway is similar. I think that the rally was a big contrast in vigor to Biden. It showed part of what the Democratic ticket had been missing in recent months is somebody who can go out and give a speech like that in front of a roaring crowd. But to my eye, this is an odd strategy for Kamala Harris to focus on more government. Government can take care of your retirement and your health care and your child care, because she has a reputation already as someone who is more of a true left winger, if I can use that term, than Joe Biden, who ran as a centrist, a moderate, somebody who would unite the country. And I grant that I don't think that he is governed that way. But the list of statements that opponents are going to pull from Kamala Harris's record in the Senate and in the 2020 campaign is pretty long. And a really good example is an ad that is now being run in Pennsylvania by the Republican Senate candidate, David McCormick. Listen to this.
I am prepared to get rid of the filibuster to pass a Green New Deal. There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking.
Would you ban offshore drilling?
Yes.
What is the solution for voters in the fossil fuel industry?
Giving the workers an ability to transition. We're not going to treat people who are undocumented cross borders criminals. That's correct.
Raise your hand if you think it should be a civil offense rather than a crime to cross a border without documentation.
Abolish ICE. Yeah. Is that a position you agree with?
And we need to probably think about starting from scratch. Outdated, it is wrong-headed thinking to think that the only way you're going to get communities to be safe is to put more police officers on the street.
Would you support changing the dietary guidelines?
Yes.
The food pyramid. For people
Yes.
to reduce red meat specifically.
Yes.
People who are convicted in prison, like the Boston Marathon bomber, on death row, people who are convicted of sexual assault, they should be able to vote?
I think we should have that conversation. We have to have a buyback program, and I support a mandatory buyback program.
So for people out there who like their insurance, well, they don't get to keep it.
Let's eliminate all of that. Let's move on. I am opposed to any policy that would deny any human being public health, period.
All I can say is, wow, it's hard to know where to start there. Reducing red meat, getting rid of private health insurance, a mandatory buyback program, votes for people who are on death row. And to my mind, Kamala Harris's strategy, she's getting a rare opportunity here to skip the Democratic primary, not have to pander to polarized primary voters, and go straight to the general election. And I don't know why she isn't locked in on swing voters in swing states and trying to make the argument that that's not what Kamala Harris stands for in 2024.
Well, it's absolutely incredible to hear Kamala Harris, in her own words in that ad, wrapping her hands around so many extremely progressive positions that are so far out of step from where the American center is. And I think it just reinforces the notion that she is a California politician to the core who has never run in a competitive race. She was district attorney of San Francisco, attorney general of California, and then entered the Senate seat from California, and did so at a time in 2016 when progressives in the Democratic Party were moving much further to the left than they had been beforehand. And you can hear the ease with which she expresses all of those opinions, restricting consumption of red meat, breaking through the filibuster to pass a Green New Deal. She doesn't even really know that the ideas she's describing are controversial. She thinks that they're completely normal things that the majority of Americans want to see, if only those nefarious Republicans, and especially Donald Trump, would get out of the way. And so I think it reinforces exactly what you're saying, Kyle, that she doesn't understand what voters in swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania are actually looking for in a potential president. And she probably has no strategy to tack to the center to get away from some of the positions of the Biden administration that had turned people off, the underperformance on border security and inflation especially, and actually put together a program that can appeal to those voters. She's in a very big political bubble, and a lot is going to hang on her choice of a vice presidential candidate and surrounding herself with advisors who actually do have a sense of where the political center is in the country today. But there's no sign that Harris herself has the political instincts to be able to make a move like that.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Kim, I guess a couple theories about this strategy by Kamala Harris. One, I suppose, is that she is from California and doesn't know how to appeal to swing voters, as Monet describes. Another might be that she has inherited the campaign infrastructure of Joe Biden, including some of his staff. And so that might make it harder for her to put any real distance between herself and the president. A third is that this is who Kamala Harris really is deep down. She is a progressive, true believer. And so she doesn't want to do any sort of pivot. She really wants to be the person who fulfills the rest of Joe Biden's Build Back Better agenda, the parts that he couldn't get through a Democratic Senate. But it is fascinating to see the enthusiasm on the Democratic side of the aisle for her. Some of that is just, I think they were looking at the polls showing President Biden losing, potentially in a rout, losing swing states in a way that would make it very hard for Democrats to win some of these disputed Senate races to try to take back the House. And so some of it may be a relief rally, but this is from a memo put out by the now Harris campaign. It says in the first 24 hours after receiving President Biden's endorsement, Team Harris raised over $81 million, the most in a 24-hour period in the history of presidential politics. As of Tuesday, that figure is up to $126 million. So, Kim, it seems that the Harris campaign is not going to lack for resources, and some of that may be people who were not thrilled with either of these candidates, who'd been holding off on supporting President Biden because of doubts about him, and now they're rushing to open their wallets.
All of those reasons you gave for her campaign actions are very valid. I would add one more that I think is perhaps the most overweening reason that you see her doubling down on a liberal strategy in the campaign. And that is simply, if we have learned anything from the Democratic Party in the last decade, it's that progressives are on the march. They are the loudest voice in the party. And it seems that even though they are a minority in the party, even though it was moderate voters in the end in South Carolina and beyond who swooped in to rescue the nomination, as it were, for Joe Biden against Bernie Sanders, because they were so worried about a progressive being on the ticket, even though those progressives are a minority, everyone dances to their tune. And it doesn't matter if it's debates that are going on in Congress or foreign policy issues. I mean, look at Joe Biden just in the past month as he was still in the race, but looked to be losing things. He too was doubling down on red meat for the progressive base, announcing more student loan cancellations, national rent control. I mean, these are not the actions of folks who are trying to appeal to voters in the middle. I really think Kamala Harris is setting herself up for a problem here. There was a quote in one of the newspapers from an unnamed campaign advisor, someone close to her, saying, you know, the Midwest, the Rust Belt, that's not really her place. That's not where she's going to win this. That's a quite remarkable statement. They suggested that instead she was going to focus on places like Nevada and Arizona. You know, right now, Democrats are only down by a point or two in those Midwestern states. They're down by significantly more if you look at the battleground polls in Arizona and Nevada. Getting those voters back by doubling down on a liberal agenda and trying to curry voters in that state versus trying to flip a few more working class voters in the Midwest just seems like a crazy notion.
It does seem, though, that the polls, the national polls at least, have tightened since Joe Biden's withdrawal from the race. If you look at those that are included in the Real Clear Politics polling average, there's an NPR poll with Trump up by 1, a Morning Consult survey with Trump up by 2, and a Reuters Ipsos poll with Harris up by 2. And those are national polls, not swing state polls, and that we have a state-by-state election in the Electoral College. But it does seem that this is an improvement on the real polling disaster that Joe Biden was facing. And one question, I guess, Monet, is how much this is just a Harris honeymoon, in the words of of a memo put out by a Trump pollster. Here's part of what he says. He says, we will start to see public polling, particularly national public polls, where Harris is gaining on or even leading President Trump. But he is arguing that this is just a manifestation of the wall-to-wall coverage that Harris is now receiving from the media. And Monet, I wonder what you make of that idea. And I suppose maybe it depends on how much those kinds of arguments that Dave McCormick is making, that Harris is a real left-winger, how much those break through to voters.
Well, I think there is no doubt that Harris is going to have an immediate bump. You're already starting to see it in some of those earliest polls that have come out after Joe Biden decided to renounce the nomination and endorse her, that she performed slightly better than he did against Trump in the polls. And I do think it makes a lot of sense because there were a lot of young Democratic voters. These are not swing voters, but solidly liberal-leaning voters who nonetheless were not enthusiastic about going to the polls in November to vote for Joe Biden, particularly because of his age, who now are back on board. And I think you've seen a swell in the proportion of Democratic likely voters, probably the same thing among a lot of minority voters, in particular Black women who are enthusiastic about the Harris run. And so you're going to see a bump, and that will play out particularly in states that do have a large African-American population, like North Carolina, Georgia, etc. But I think that there's another question about whether Harris will have the stamina once her campaign actually gets underway. She's very soon going to have to actually address the press instead of just speaking to favorable audiences. And she's going to take tough questions. She's going to have to lay out what her agenda for the next term is going to be. And as we discussed in the first segment, there's every sign that she's going to go with an even more liberal platform than the one that Joe Biden had embraced. And I think that that could really imperil her ability to win in some of those Midwestern states that Democrats need to be competitive. I think it's worth remembering that Joe Biden was able to beat President Trump in 2020 by winning back Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which Trump had won in 2016. And he did that in part by pitching a somewhat centrist approach, saying that he was going to grow the economy by investing in jobs, something that could appeal to working class or middle class voter in some of these swing states. Kamala Harris has not taken anything like that approach, at least so far, and nothing in her political history suggests that she's able to convincingly make that kind of case, especially since it was shown to be completely false during the 4 years of the Biden-Harris presidency. And so she's going to have a really tough time, I think, being competitive down the stretch. And a lot of the enthusiasm that we've seen over the past week is going to flag if she does continue to lean into a more progressive pitch to voters.